Daddy? Why is it so dark in here? Because I want it dark, Emma. Go back downstairs. Are you sick again? Go back downstairs. I need to be alone. You're not mean, Daddy. You're just sad. I know because Mommy used to get sad too, before. Silence. A long, heavy silence, the kind that fills a room like water fills a sinking boat. I'll stay with you, Daddy, the small voice said, and Daniel Cole heard the sound of tiny sneakers crossing the hardwood floor of a bedroom he hadn't let anyone enter in 14 months. You don't have to talk. I'll just sit here. Have you ever wondered how far a father can disappear inside his own grief before it takes a child's fearless love to pull him back from the edge? Because that is exactly the story you are about to watch unfold. The house on Larkspur Hill had once been full of light. Daniel remembered that, in the distant, aching way a person remembers a country they can no longer visit. He remembered his wife Sarah standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands, laughing at something on the radio. He remembered his daughter Emma, barely 4 years old then, chasing the family dog across the backyard while Sarah filmed it on her phone, certain, the way parents always are, that there would be 1,000 more afternoons exactly like that one. There had not been 1,000 more afternoons. There had been one terrible Tuesday in March, an aneurysm with no warning, no symptoms, no fair notice given, and then there had been a funeral, and then there had been a house that Daniel could no longer walk through without feeling like every room was a wound that refused to close. He remembered, too, the small things nobody tells you about grief before it happens to you. He remembered standing in the cereal aisle 3 weeks after the funeral, frozen in front of a box of the oatmeal Sarah used to buy, unable to decide whether buying it again was a betrayal of moving on or a betrayal of forgetting her, and standing there so long that a stranger eventually asked if he was all right. He remembered the first time Emma asked him a question about her mother that he simply could not answer without his voice breaking, and how, rather than let his daughter see him break, he had told her he needed to check on dinner and left the room instead. Small moments like that one, repeated dozens of times over dozens of days, had slowly taught him that avoidance was safer than honesty, that a closed door hurt less than an open wound, until the lesson had become so deeply learned that he stopped noticing he was living it at all. He had tried, in the first few months, the way people try when they still believe grief obeys effort. He had gone back to work at the architecture firm he'd co-founded, had sat through client meetings nodding at things he didn't hear, had come home each evening and made Emma dinner and helped with homework and tucked her in, going through the motions of fatherhood like a man reading lines from a script he no longer believed in. But something in him had been quietly closing, door by door, room by room, until one night, 8 months after Sarah died, Daniel Cole walked into the primary bedroom he could no longer bear to sleep in and moved permanently into the small guest room at the end of the hall, drew the curtains, and did not open them again. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would come out of it once the business stabilized, once Emma started a new school year, once enough time had passed that the sharp edges of loss might dull into something survivable. But temporary, for Daniel, had become permanent in the way that avoided things always do, quietly, without him ever choosing it directly. He hired a full-time housekeeper named Louise to manage the household, to make sure Emma had meals and clean clothes and help with her reading, and he retreated further and further into that dark guest room, until the man his daughter used to run to at the door every evening had become a shape behind a closed door that she was told, gently but firmly, not to disturb. Emma Cole was 8 years old, and she had inherited her mother's stubborn, clear-eyed way of seeing the world exactly as it was rather than as adults wished her to see it. She understood, in the plain, unclouded way children understand hard things, that her father was not simply working late or tired or busy the way Louise kept explaining. She understood that something in her daddy had broken the same night something broke in her, and that the difference between them was that she had kept walking forward into her days, however wobbly, while he had stopped walking altogether. For over a year, Emma respected the closed door. She left drawings under it some evenings, pictures of their old backyard, of the dog, of the three of them together the way they used to be, and in the mornings the drawings would be gone from the hallway floor, though she never saw her father take them and never knew if he looked at them or simply threw them away. She ate dinner most nights with Louise in the kitchen, did her homework at the table alone, went to bed in a house that had once been loud with laughter and was now so quiet she sometimes hummed to herself just to hear a human sound. But that particular evening, the one that would end up changing everything, Emma had come home from school with a math test folded in her backpack, 98%, the highest score in her class, and something in her small chest had simply refused to let the news disappear into Louise's polite, distracted congratulations. She wanted her father. Not the shape behind the door. Her actual father, the one who used to lift her onto his shoulders in the kitchen and spin her until she shrieked with laughter. She climbed the stairs that evening with a certainty that surprised even her, walked straight past Louise's protests, and pushed open a door that had not opened for anyone in 14 months. The room was dark, curtains drawn against an afternoon sun that hadn't touched that carpet in over a year. It smelled the way closed rooms smell, stale and heavy, mixed with the faint bitterness of medication Emma didn't recognize but had begun to notice appearing in greater numbers on her father's nightstand. Daniel sat in an armchair by the shuttered window, not the bed, as if some part of him still refused full surrender to sleep, still held some vigil he couldn't name even to himself. He turned his head sharply at the sound of the door. "Emma. What are you doing in here?" It wasn't a question so much as a wall going up. "I got a 98 on my math test," she said, holding it up even though the room was too dark for him to actually see it. "Highest in the class." "That's good, sweetheart. Go show Louise. I need to rest. Go back downstairs. I need to be alone." Emma didn't move. She looked at the outline of her father in the near dark, a man who had once been broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, now thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt in a way that frightened her more than she let herself show. She thought of something her mother used to say, back when Sarah was still alive and Daniel would come home stressed from work, short-tempered, snapping at nothing. "Don't take it personally, baby," Sarah used to whisper. "Daddy's not mad at you. He's just tired in his heart." "You're not mean, Daddy," Emma said quietly. "You're just sad." "I know because Mommy used to get sad too, before." Daniel flinched as though she'd struck him. Nobody in this house said Sarah's name out loud anymore. Louise avoided it out of a misplaced sense of protecting him. His own family avoided it out of their own discomfort with grief. Only his 8-year-old daughter, apparently, still had the courage to say the word mommy in a house that had otherwise gone silent around her absence. "I'll stay with you, Daddy," Emma said, and crossed the room, her small sneakers silent on the carpet, and sat down on the floor beside his armchair, tucking her knees up to her chest the way she did when she watched television at home. "You don't have to talk. I'll just sit here." Daniel opened his mouth to tell her to leave, the same words he'd used to push away every well-meaning relative, every concerned coworker, every grief counselor his sister had tried to schedule for him over the past year. But something about the small, steady shape of his daughter sitting on the floor of his darkened room, patient as stone, made the words die in his throat. He said nothing. Emma said nothing. And for the first time in 14 months, Daniel Cole sat in a room with another human being without either of them needing to fill the silence with anything at all. She stayed for 20 minutes that first evening before Louise, worried and apologetic, came to collect her for dinner. Daniel didn't tell his daughter to stop coming. He also didn't invite her back. But the next evening, Emma returned anyway, this time with a book under her arm, and sat on the same spot on the floor, reading quietly to herself while her father stared at the crack of light along the edge of the curtain, and neither of them said a single word the whole time, and somehow, for Daniel, it was the first evening in over a year that had felt survivable rather than merely endured. This became their pattern. Emma would arrive after dinner, sometimes with homework, sometimes with a book, once with a small deck of cards she'd found in a drawer downstairs that she laid out for a game of solitaire on the floor, narrating her own moves out loud in a soft, unbothered voice that filled the room without demanding anything from him. Daniel began, without quite admitting it to himself, to wait for the sound of her footsteps on the stairs each evening, a small ember of anticipation in a chest that had otherwise gone cold. He never joined her games. He never asked about her day the way a healthy father would. But he stopped telling her to leave, and some nights, when she left, he found himself standing at the crack in the curtain a little longer than usual, watching the last light drain from the sky, feeling something that wasn't quite hope but was no longer entirely despair either. One evening, weeks into this quiet routine, Emma brought up a small battery-operated lantern from the garage without asking permission, set it on the floor beside her instead of turning on the overhead light, and said nothing about it at all, simply letting its soft yellow glow fill a corner of the room that had been dark for over a year. Daniel watched the small light from his armchair for a long time that night, saying nothing, and the next evening, when Emma came in, the lantern was already sitting in its usual spot, switched on, waiting for her. Neither of them ever mentioned it directly. It became one of a dozen small, wordless agreements that slowly accumulated between them, agreements neither of them announced but both of them kept, the lantern each evening, the cracked door left slightly open during the day even when Daniel remained inside, a second chair Emma eventually dragged in from the hallway and left permanently in the corner, as if daring her father to eventually acknowledge that she intended to keep coming back for as long as it took. Louise noticed the shift before anyone else did, the way household staff often notice things families miss simply because they are paying closer attention out of necessity. She began leaving 2 dinner plates on trays outside the guest room door instead of 1, without ever being asked to, a quiet act of faith that Emma would, once again, find her way inside. She never said anything to Daniel about it directly, worried that acknowledging the fragile routine out loud might somehow break it, but she watched the tray return each night with both plates emptied instead of 1, and allowed herself, in private, a small and cautious relief. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the shape of Daniel's older sister, Renata, a woman whose love for her brother was real but whose way of expressing it had always run through control rather than patience. Renata had watched Daniel's decline from a careful distance for over a year, offering advice that went unheeded, therapists that went unvisited, invitations that went unanswered, and her worry, curdled slowly over months into something closer to alarm, finally reached a boiling point on a Sunday afternoon when she arrived unannounced and found Emma alone in the kitchen making herself a sandwich because Louise had the day off and Daniel hadn't come downstairs since the previous evening. "This can't continue, Daniel," Renata said that night, standing in the doorway of the dark guest room with the particular fury of someone who loves too fiercely to be gentle about it. "She's 8 years old. She's raising herself in this house while you sit in the dark. I've spoken to a family attorney. I want to explore temporary guardianship, just until you're better, just until you can actually be present for her." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, worse somehow than anything grief itself had done to him, because underneath the anger they provoked was a small, terrified voice that wondered if his sister might be right. He had let himself disappear so completely that another adult was now standing in his doorway suggesting his own daughter might be better off without him in the house at all. He wanted to scream at Renata to leave, wanted to slam the door the way he'd slammed it on everyone else for over a year. Instead, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, he found himself unable to summon the numb, protective anger that had carried him through every other difficult conversation, because some part of him understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that if things continued exactly as they were, his sister's fear was not unreasonable. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his armchair long after Emma had gone to bed, staring at the crack of light along the curtain edge, turning his sister's words over and over, feeling the full, crushing weight of everything he had let go of over the past 14 months settle onto his chest at once, so heavy that at some point past midnight he found it genuinely difficult to breathe, though he told himself it was only anxiety. Only grief finally catching up to him the way it always eventually does. It was Emma who found him the next morning, slumped forward in the armchair, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and irregular in a way that made her small chest seize with a fear more real than anything a normal 8-year-old should ever have to feel. She had come in early, before school, simply to say good morning the way she'd quietly started doing again, and instead she found her father barely conscious, one hand pressed weakly against his chest. She did not scream, though every instinct in her small body wanted to. Some steady, inherited peace of her mother's calm under pressure rose up instead. She ran to the hallway, grabbed the house phone Louise kept charged on the side table, and dialed 911 with hands that shook but fingers that didn't miss a single digit, giving the dispatcher their address in a clear, careful voice, the way she'd once heard her mother do years ago when a neighbor had fallen off a ladder. Then she ran back into the dark room, climbed onto the arm of her father's chair, and took his hand. "I'm right here, Daddy," she said, her voice trembling but her grip fierce. "I'm not leaving. I already called for help. Just hold on. Please hold on." Daniel, through a fog of pain and encroaching darkness, felt his daughter's small hand gripping his, heard her voice cutting through the roaring in his ears, and something in him that had been quietly giving up for over a year suddenly, violently, refused to. He would learn later, from the cardiologist at the hospital, that what he'd experienced was a severe cardiac event brought on by a combination of untreated stress, months of poor sleep, poor nutrition, and a heart condition that had likely been developing silently for years, worsened immeasurably by the particular, crushing weight of unprocessed grief that had kept him locked in a dark room instead of seeking help. The doctor did not say it unkindly, but he said it plainly: grief, left untreated for long enough, can become a physical illness in its own right, and Daniel's body had finally been forced to say what his voice had refused to say for 14 months. The ambulance arrived within 9 minutes. Emma rode in the front of the vehicle beside the paramedic, refusing, with the same quiet, immovable stubbornness that had first walked her into his dark room weeks earlier, to be left behind at the house with Louise. She sat in the hospital waiting room that evening in her school uniform, having missed the entire day of classes, her math test with the 98% still folded in her backpack because she'd never gotten the chance to properly show it to him, and waited. Renata arrived within the hour, her earlier fury dissolved instantly into raw fear the moment she heard her brother had collapsed. She sat beside Emma in the waiting room, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, an actual conversation happened between aunt and niece that had nothing to do with schedules or homework or polite distance. Renata asked Emma, gently, what her father had been like lately, in the dark room, and Emma, in the plain, devastating honesty only children seem able to access, told her aunt everything: the silence, the drawings that disappeared without comment, the 20 minutes a night that had slowly stretched into more, the way her father never told her to leave anymore even though he never quite asked her to stay either. Renata put her arm around her niece and cried quietly in a hospital waiting room chair, understanding for the first time that her brother's retreat into darkness had not been the absence of love for his daughter, but a man so overwhelmed by loss that love itself had become something he no longer trusted himself to survive feeling. She thought of the guardianship papers still sitting, unsigned, in her car, and felt, for the first time, ashamed of how close she had come to trying to take the one person who had actually managed to reach her brother, however slowly, away from him entirely. Daniel spent 6 days in the cardiac unit. The first 2 were critical, monitored closely, his condition serious enough that the doctors used careful, guarded language with Renata in the hallway, language that Emma, sitting very still in the corner of the family lounge with her backpack in her lap, heard every word of despite everyone's best efforts to spare her. She refused, just as she had refused at home, to be sent away to stay with a neighbor or a family friend. She slept in a hospital chair beside her father's bed for 3 of those 6 nights, her hand resting on top of his even in sleep, until an understanding nurse quietly set up a small cot for her instead. On the second night, Daniel's heart rhythm destabilized suddenly around 3 in the morning, monitors screaming, a rapid response team filling the small room within seconds, and Emma was pulled gently but firmly into the hallway by a nurse while doctors worked to stabilize him. She stood pressed against the corridor wall in her socked feet, watching through the narrow window in the door as a team of strangers in scrubs worked over her father's body, and for the first time since the morning she'd found him slumped in his armchair, her carefully held composure cracked. She did not sob loudly. She simply stood very still, tears running silently down her face, whispering the same 6 words over and over under her breath like a private prayer she'd invented herself. "I'm right here, Daddy. I'm right here." The rapid response team stabilized him 20 minutes later, and when Emma was allowed back into the room, she climbed immediately back into her chair beside the bed without a word, took his hand exactly where she had left it, and did not let go again for the rest of the night, even after the nurses assured her, repeatedly, that it was safe for her to sleep. It was on that second night, watching his daughter refuse even exhaustion itself rather than release his hand, that Daniel, drifting in and out of a sedated half-consciousness, first felt something shift inside him that no medication could explain, a fierce, undeniable will to still be here in the morning, not for himself, but because an 8-year-old girl had made him a promise in a dark room weeks earlier, and some deep, wordless part of him understood that promises, once accepted, run in both directions. It was on the fourth day, once Daniel was finally stable enough to speak in full sentences without exhausting himself, that he asked Emma the question that had been building in his chest since the moment he'd first opened his eyes in the ICU and found her sitting beside him. "Why didn't you go stay with Aunt Renata, baby? You could have slept in a real bed. Gone to school." Emma considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to every important question. "Because you needed somebody to stay," she said simply. "And I already promised. I said I'll stay with you, Daddy. I don't break promises. Mommy taught me that." Daniel Cole, a man who had spent 14 months convinced that surviving his wife's death meant disappearing from his own life as quietly as possible, felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the damaged heart muscle the doctors were now monitoring so closely. He pulled his daughter into a careful hug, mindful of the wires and monitors still attached to him, and for the first time since Sarah's funeral, he allowed himself to cry in front of another person instead of alone behind a locked door. The recovery that followed was neither quick nor easy. Daniel began, at his cardiologist's insistence and with a nudge from Renata that this time came wrapped in gentleness rather than ultimatum, seeing a grief counselor twice a week, a quiet, patient woman named Dr. Ferris who did not try to rush him past his loss but instead helped him understand that grief, left completely unspoken for over a year, had built a wall inside him so thick that even his love for his own daughter had been trapped behind it, present but inaccessible, real but unreachable. He learned, slowly, painfully, to say Sarah's name out loud again, first in Dr. Ferris's office, then, eventually, at his own kitchen table. Dr. Ferris asked him, in one of their early sessions, what had actually changed the night Emma first walked into his dark room, and Daniel sat with the question for a long time before answering. "She didn't ask me to be okay," he finally said. "Everyone else wanted me to be okay. My sister wanted it, my co-workers wanted it, even Louise wanted it, in her quiet way. Emma just wanted to sit next to me while I wasn't." Dr. Ferris told him that was, in her professional experience, one of the rarest and most powerful gifts a person could offer someone in grief, the willingness to simply stay present without demanding recovery on any particular schedule, and that his daughter, at 8 years old, had somehow already understood something many adults spend a lifetime failing to learn. Renata, for her part, spent months quietly working through her own guilt over the guardianship papers she'd once had drawn up, papers she eventually tore up entirely one afternoon in front of Daniel, not as a grand gesture but as a private apology neither of them needed to discuss further. She began coming by more often after that, no longer checking in out of alarm but out of something closer to simple family affection, bringing Emma small gifts and staying for dinner instead of standing anxiously in doorways. He also learned, in the weeks that followed his discharge, to open the curtains in that guest room each morning, a small daily act that felt, at first, almost unbearably difficult, and then, gradually, like breathing. Emma noticed before anyone else did. She came home from school one Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the hospital, and found her father not in the dark guest room at all, but downstairs in the kitchen, badly attempting to make the same pancakes Sarah used to make on Saturday mornings, flour dusted across the counter and across his shirt, the recipe card in Sarah's handwriting propped up against the sugar jar. "They're probably going to taste terrible," Daniel admitted, looking at his daughter with an expression somewhere between hope and fear, the expression of a man taking his first real risk in over a year. "But I wanted to try." Emma looked at the lopsided, slightly burnt pancakes on the counter, looked at her father standing there covered in flour, looking more like himself than she'd seen him look in longer than she could clearly remember, and felt something in her small chest loosen for the first time in 14 months. "They look perfect, Daddy," she said, and meant it completely. Louise, who had quietly worried for over a year that she was watching a family slowly come apart in front of her without any way to stop it, began to notice small, ordinary changes that meant more than any of them said out loud. Daniel asking about Emma's day at dinner and actually listening to the answer, Daniel attending a parent-teacher conference for the first time in over a year, Daniel, on a Sunday afternoon 6 months after the hospital, finally, carefully, painfully, sorting through Sarah's closet with Emma beside him, the two of them choosing together which of her mother's things Emma might want to keep for herself one day. The dark guest room eventually stopped being where Daniel slept at all. It took him nearly a year to walk back into the primary bedroom he had once shared with Sarah, and when he finally did, he didn't do it alone. Emma helped him choose new curtains for the windows, ones that let in more light than the old ones ever had, and together they hung a single framed photograph on the wall, the same one Emma used to draw from memory over and over during the year her father had been gone behind a closed door, the three of them together in the backyard, Sarah laughing, Emma mid-run, Daniel caught in the act of reaching for his daughter, a moment none of them had known, when it happened, would one day become the thing that helped pull two of them back to each other. 2 years after the night Emma first pushed open that dark bedroom door with her math test in hand, Daniel stood on the back porch of the house on Larkspur Hill, watching his now 10-year-old daughter chase fireflies across a yard that had, slowly, over many small and unremarkable evenings, filled back up with light and noise and life. Renata sat beside him with a glass of iced tea, no longer visiting out of worry but simply because Sunday dinners at her brother's house had become, again, something she looked forward to. Louise, technically no longer needed as a live-in housekeeper now that Daniel had returned fully to the business of living, still came by twice a week anyway, because somewhere in the darkest year of this family's life, she had stopped being an employee and started being something closer to family. Daniel had, that same year, finally donated the last of the medications that had once crowded his nightstand in the dark guest room, had returned to the architecture firm not as a man simply going through the motions but as someone who once again cared about the buildings he designed, had even, tentatively, begun dating again, a slow and careful process he approached the way a person relearns to walk after a long illness, one small step at a time, never rushing past what still hurt. None of it erased what he had lost. Grief, Dr. Ferris had told him early on, does not disappear. It simply learns to live alongside a person rather than swallowing them whole. Daniel had come to understand the truth of that slowly, the way a person understands the changing of a season, not in a single moment but across 100 small ones. Emma ran up to the porch that evening, breathless, cupping a firefly carefully in her small hands, holding it up so her father could see its faint, blinking light in the growing dusk. "Look, Daddy," she said. "It's still glowing. Even in the dark." Daniel looked at his daughter, at the small, stubborn light held so carefully in her hands, and thought of a version of himself from 2 years earlier who had believed that darkness was the only honest response to a loss that large, who had genuinely, quietly believed that disappearing was a form of protecting the people he loved rather than abandoning them. He pulled her into his lap, careful of nothing now, because there was no fragile heart monitor keeping them apart anymore, only the ordinary, unremarkable joy of a father holding his daughter on a porch at dusk. "It sure is, baby," he said. "It sure is. And it's because you never let me forget how to see it." Somewhere behind them, through the kitchen window, Renata laughed at something Louise had said, the sound of it carrying easily across the yard, ordinary and warm and entirely unremarkable, the exact kind of sound that a year and a half earlier, Daniel would not have believed his house could ever hold again. He thought, watching his daughter run back out into the deepening dusk to catch another firefly, that this was the truest thing grief had ever taught him, that the people who stay beside you in your darkest room are not always the ones the world expects, and that sometimes it takes a child's simple, fearless promise, "I'll stay with you," to remind a broken man that the dark was never meant to be permanent, only survived one small unremarkable evening at a time, together. And if there was one thing Daniel Cole hoped Emma would carry with her long after she'd grown and left this porch and this yard and this house behind, it was not a lesson about grief at all, but something simpler, something he tried, every single evening after that, to show her rather than merely tell her, that showing up, quietly and without condition, again and again, for the people you love, is very often the whole of what love actually requires, no grand gesture necessary, only the willingness, evening after evening, to simply stay.